Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Look, these are people, and they've been through hell to get here, and what they want is a chance. And that is something that this country has historically given them. And it would be a tragedy for that to be ended.
Coming up on Dialogue, I talk with David Miliband, the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, about the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II and how he thinks the U.S. should help. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A record number of people around the world are now fleeing their homes. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that war and persecution have displaced more than 65 million people. Governments and nonprofits are strained to the max trying to help. One of the non-governmental organizations in the arena is the International Rescue Committee, which operates as both an aid group and a resettlement agency. All told, IRC programs and partnerships are in more than 40 countries and in 29 U.S. cities, including Boise. In the summer of 2016, I sat down at the Sun Valley Writers Conference with the president and CEO of the IRC, David Miliband. Miliband is also the former foreign minister of the United Kingdom. We talked about the causes of this mass refugee movement, the fears and challenges involved, and why he thinks America is uniquely suited to help. Let's talk for our viewers about the scale of what is happening around the world. 2015, as I understand it, was a world record for forced displacement for refugee movement. I want to say 65 million people, both internally and externally displaced from their homes, and 20 million of those being refugees outside of their own country. Yeah,
the figures are stark and clear, which is that refugees, which means someone who's driven from their own home country, not just their own home, driven from their own home country across the border into a neighboring country because of conflict or persecution. That number is effectively up to 25 million in 2015. And then the number who are driven from their own home but don't leave their own country is 40 million. And the real reason is that you've got these civil wars that you can read about in Somalia or Afghanistan or most obviously Syria, that are expelling people at this extraordinary rate, and these are people who are victims of terror of an unspeakable kind.
This is not just a snapshot in time. This is something that is going to continue and continue. I mean, this is part of a global trend, is it not?
Well, that is debated, but I agree with you. And the big drivers of this movement, which are ethnic, religious, political conflict, seem to be on a trend line upwards, not just a blip. And you don't reach 65 million people displaced by conflict just out of a blip. And I think the way I'd summarize it for your viewers is that the old wars are carrying on in Afghanistan, in Somalia, two countries that Americans who remember the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s will know well, but new wars are starting. Syria 5 years ago, South Sudan 2 years ago. And it's that combination, the old war's carrying on. Congo is a so-called Democratic Republic of Congo. You've got people in Idaho from there. That's a 35-year conflict. And then you've got new wars starting. And so that's the danger. You've got a cumulative growth in the number of people who are displaced by conflict. Very few of them able to go home because the wars don't end.
At the same time, we're in the wealthiest time that our world has ever seen. We have these disparities going on at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Look, the world is wealthier than ever before. That on a global level, poverty is down. If you measure the global 7.5 billion population and take out the countries and just do it as a global population, inequality is actually reducing, not increasing. Inequality is increasing within nations, but it is reducing globally because China and India is bringing people out of poverty. It's a more connected world than ever before. It's a world where women and girls have more opportunities than ever before, still starkly unequal even in our societies, but around the world women and girls have got opportunities that they've never had before. Yet despite that, this rising tide of prosperity and opportunity is balanced by this rising tide of struggle and conflict.
We see the video of the refugees, coming ashore by any means necessary getting to Europe. But in point of fact, other countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, are housing or trying to take care of millions more.
Yeah, I think it's very easy for us in the West. I live in New York, run an NGO based in New York, but I'm obviously from the UK. It's easy for us in the newspapers to think, my goodness, there's a lot of people coming. You're a welcoming community, but people are wondering, well, how many people should we take? But it's worth people knowing. A country like Turkey, it's a quarter of the size of the US in population terms. It's got 2.7 million Syrian refugees in it. A country like Lebanon, tiny Lebanon, is a population of 4.5 or 5 million. It's got 1.2 million refugees. 1 in 5 of the population is a refugee. So you're right to say that we've got to keep our own perspective about the challenges that we face in integrating thousands of people, not millions of people, into our own country.
But you have been quite critical of how few Syrians America has taken, and really called out that issue and said that America should be doing more to, in your words, share the burdens of globalization with the blessings. What more do you think the United States should be doing?
This country has historically been the place that has offered haven to people for really for 2 centuries. I mean, longer actually. If you go back to the founders of the Republic, they were fleeing persecution. And what I always say to people is that it's not just the right thing to do to offer haven for refugees. It is also a practical thing to do because you've got a good system. And because of the geography of this country, it's not just that you can spread people out, you can choose who you want. It's not like Europe where 1 million people can arrive illegally. You've got your own issue to do with immigration from the south, but that's a separate issue. For refugees, you can choose who you're going to pick. And it's also a smart thing to do because America's standing in the world is in part dependent on the fact that it's a multi-faith community that welcomes people from all over the world and is able to show that people get along. And I think it's important that you think that America has taken 3,200 Syrians since the war began. So that's more or less 500 or 600 a year. And that's noticed around the world. And so
as being low.
As being low. I mean, if you remember the number I gave you for Turkey, 2.7 million people, 1.2 million in Lebanon, even Canada, your northern neighbor. I mean, they've taken 25,000 in the last 6 months. And the US has taken 3,200 over 5 years. And so when people say that in respect of refugee resettlement, America should do more, what they're saying is, look, you've got a well-proven track for screening people, CIA, the FBI, you've got agencies who crawl over all of the applications, interviews done with people. So it's right to say we want to make sure that our security is protected, but you've got a well-documented system for doing so.
But maybe that's why it's going so slowly.
Well, no, because 5 years on, if the process, I mean, I'd like the process to be quicker, and I think it could be quicker, but 12 months to screen someone doesn't explain why 5 years later only 3,200 people have come in. So you've got a good screening system, or a very effective screening system, but it's not being used at the moment to fulfill a quota of Syrians that could really be a global contribution consistent with your leadership.
Why do you think that is?
Well, obviously, there are bureaucratic issues about it, and that's led to the 10,000 number that the administration have now put on. But you'll know well, and I'm sure you've reported, there's a political argument going on in this country about whether or not you should have refugees here. And the argument takes place at 2 levels. One part of the argument says there's no screening, it's dangerous. Well, that's just not true. I mean, there is screening. 750,000 refugees have come since 9/11. 5 of them have been arrested in the course of the last 15 years on terrorism-related offences, all of them to do with terrorism abroad, not to do with terrorism in the US. And your system has worked because it's picked them up before they caused any trouble. No Syrians have ever been arrested on terrorism-related offences. So one set of criticisms frankly makes allegations that are just not true. They're flooding in here and they don't get checked. That's not true. There's a second set of criticisms which says, look, we've got to balance this. does our system work well? And it's perfectly legitimate for people to ask those kind of questions, but they need to be answered. And successive Homeland Security secretaries from both political parties have said, look, we've got a good system that we're willing to put our names behind because it works. And I think it's important to say that. We as an NGO, we work around the country in 29 US cities. We can be witnesses to the facts. We're fact witnesses, and people can have questions and we can answer them because we meet people at the airport, we help find them accommodation, we get their kids into school, we help find them work. And we can tell you that these are people who are desperate to get away from the trauma that they've been through and desperate to start their lives again.
There's a lot of fear about people who are Muslim coming into people's communities. How do you answer that?
I think that the best answer is to think there are 3,500 Muslims in the American armed forces. These are loyal, patriotic Americans who are determined to defend their country down to the sacrifice of their own lives. And talk to them, listen to their stories. Don't listen to me, listen to their stories. Secondly, talk to the people who've come here from around the world. Some of them Muslim, some of them are not Muslim, and talk to them about what they've been through and what America means to them. And what America means to them is a place where you don't get judged by the color of your skin or the mosque that you worship at, but by the content of your character. And thirdly, think about what's made the country great. The truth is that people of all faiths have come here and made the country great. And it's striking that if you look at the opinion polls before the Second World War, the number of people who opposed Jews coming to America was 2/3. Pretty similar to the number that, say, in opinion polls, they're worried about Muslims coming here. If you look at they didn't have opinion polls then, but if you look in the late 19th century at what was said about Irish who were coming to America, there was vitriol poured in their direction of a really striking kind. If you look at what was said about Italians in the early 1900s, people who are different, there's always a question, well, what are they going to be like? And I think it's worth repeating that old slogan, we're 99% the same and 1% different. And we spend all of our time talking about the 1% that's different, not the 99% that's the same. And I think that's important.
Well, the people that I've spoken to who have these fears, they say, well, Christians don't strap bombs to themselves and blow themselves up. I mean, they're just very, very fearful of terrorism coming to this country, and they associate Muslims with that.
But the terrorists are killing Muslims as well as Christians and Jews. Actually, more Muslims have been killed by Islamic terrorism than those of other faiths. And it's all, look, loving a stranger is always harder than loving a neighbor. But that's the ultimate challenge of human existence. And if we can't find ways to live together, then frankly we're going to hang separately, and that's a dangerous situation to be in. And I think that our role as a charity, which is working with federal and state and local government, but also with local people, because we have 3,500 volunteers around the country. We have volunteers in Boise who work with our office, is to say, look, these are people, and they've been through hell to get here. They've lost family members to appalling violence. They've sometimes had kids who've gone through the most unspeakable trauma. And what they want is a chance. And that is something that this country has historically given them. And it would be a tragedy for that to be ended. And the fact that this country can choose who comes here, there's no right of a refugee from Syria or anything else to come here. They only come here if the American government, having vetted them fully, decides we want you to come here. No one's forcing these people to come here. It's your choice. And they can come here and become the kind of patriotic and productive citizens that you want to have.
When you visit a camp, when you visit a beach in Greece, what is that like when you see this mass of humanity that's trying to escape?
Well, I mean, the most important thing is that you just feel very, very lucky that we weren't born there, and all of one's troubles find perspective when you see a mountain of life jackets that were used by people to cross the Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece.
Some of which are not meant to be used as life jackets.
Very good. Some of which say, the kids' life jackets say, will not prevent drowning. But in Africa, in Kenya, it has more Somalis than anywhere else in the world, 600,000 Somalis more or less in Kenya. Most of them are in camps. And they were in the camps since 1992, and some of them are still there and they expect to die there. Some of them were born there, so when you say, will you go home, they say, this is my home. So what you feel is, at worst, a sense, well, the worst is obviously the fear that people are going to die, but the next level up is just a sense of hopelessness, that they are the forgotten, stateless people of the world, and that they'll survive, but they'll not do anything more with their lives. And that makes one feel very, very empty inside.
But are you optimistic? Do you despair when you look at all these people?
I think that the way you put it is, anyone who looks at the statistics despairs, anyone who looks at the people is inspired. And as long as you remember the people, then you see that humanity has this extraordinary, not just resilience, but bounce back ability. I mean, the fact that people can go through hell but then make something of their lives tells you about the human spirit, and that's the thing that keeps you going.
You left your job as a member of parliament to take this job. I
wasn't a refugee. I can't claim to have been forced to leave as a result of persecution.
No, it's very different. But you did leave Britain, and you did leave the life that you had to take on this job, which is almost 24/7 and involves a lot of heartache. Why was it important to you? I know your father fled the Holocaust in 1940. Your mother left Poland in 1947 after the war.
46, yeah.
46. Is that part of the...
Yeah, I mean, when I did my job interview in 2013 for the IRC, which is an extraordinary charity that's founded by Einstein to rescue people from Europe, not many people know that, there were three things that made me think this was a good way of making the next professional steps in my career, beyond the adventure of living and working in New York with my family. One is that I think some of the most difficult policy questions, I'm a policy guy, some of the most difficult political policy questions are about how do you help people in the midst of war? I mean, how do you get medical aid into Syria? How do you protect women and girls from abuse in northeast Nigeria? How do you get education to kids in Afghanistan where the Taliban are still in control? So there is challenge, which I like. Secondly, I thought the organization had enormous potential to capitalize on the fact that it's focused. We work in 30 countries around the world that are in crisis. We don't work in 100 countries that have got poverty. We're focused on people who are in poverty because of crisis. And I think that that there's a potential there for us to be opinion leaders. And we're also in this remarkable situation of working around the world with 25,000 staff, but also working in the US. We work across the whole arc of crisis. So we can see it from the war to the transit route, to the fragile state where people are stuck, to then the small numbers that make it to here, to Boise, Idaho, to start their lives again. Salt Lake City, where we've got next door. Now, that was the second reason. And the third reason is my own parents were refugees. My dad was a refugee in 1940. He came as a 16-year-old to London from Belgium, did his high school graduation, went into the Royal Navy for 3 years. My mum survived the war in Poland. And in some way, I think psychologically, I was closing a circle by devoting part of my life to helping people who are they're obviously not the successor generations to my parents, but they're going through, in a subsequent generation, something not a million miles from what my parents went through. So there's a certain personal aspect to it.
When you look at this job that you took on, what has most frustrated you?
Well, the biggest frustration is that the humanitarian sector is built for the humanitarian problems of 50 years ago, which were short-term relief in refugee camps until wars ended and people went home.
Or until a famine was over or something.
Yeah. I mean, now the problems are long-term, 30-year wars. The people are living in urban areas, not in camps, and they don't go home because the wars don't end. So you need a different kind of humanitarian system. And the donors, the mainly governmental donors, my organization is 85% government funded, I mean the US government amongst others, which is, we're grateful, but governments can be quite short term. The average length of a government grant is 11 months. They can be quite risk averse when we're in very risky places. And it's important to have a sense that we've got to build a different kind of system, not just keep on peddling the old bicycle harder. Sorry to mix my metaphors, but I think that that's the biggest frustration.
But there's a challenge in the fact that we don't have clear data on what's actually being done with all this money that governments and people.
We don't have good enough data. I mean, I can tell you that 93 cents in every dollar goes to programs, not to bureaucracy. I can tell you that we helped 23 million people around the world last year. But I'd like to be able to come back on this program and say, these are the outcomes that we achieved. These are the employment that we achieved for people. This is the education that not just the number of teachers we trained, this is the number of kids who actually were able to graduate high school. And that's the leap I'd like us to be able to make over the next few years.
How much of the Brexit vote was based on anti-immigrant sentiment, not necessarily about Syrians, but about Eastern Europeans?
Yeah, quite a lot. I mean, it became the lightning rod and the catalyst was to do with migration from within the EU. It was nothing to do with race, and it was nothing to do with Muslims, and it was nothing to do with religion. It was about the allegation or the suggestion that the open movement of people within the European Union allowed for a downward pressure on wages and for people from other European countries to take British jobs. Now, in truth, the British unemployment rate is 5%, a bit like yours. So the unemployment question doesn't have much of there's no factual basis for it. And actually, if you look at the data on wages, there's not much evidence either. But there was a very strong view that the country had too many Eastern European migrants in it, so not refugees. And there's a big issue for the whole of Europe, which is how does it manage the flow of people?
Do you think Brexit will hurt
Look,
refugees?
It diverts massive attention from dealing with real issues. That's the problem. It's a massive diversion of energy and effort for the European institutions.
Many people want you to come back to Britain and help lead that country through whatever period it's about to go into.
Well, it's very nice of you to say that, but I'm focused on my job in New York. We have a parliamentary system, so it doesn't quite work in the same way. My own party's got its troubles at the moment and is trying to sort them out. So I'm focused on what I'm doing. Got big enough problems to sort out.
How worried are you, though, about Britain right now?
I'm someone who believes passionately that Europe is destined to a European future, even if it's not an EU future. The Brexit does not change geography. Britain is a European country. It's full of Europeans. I mean, I'm a European as well as a Brit. And the concern has got to be a material concern, an economic concern, because it seems to me undeniable not just that Britain's going to go through short-term economic pain as a result of this vote on the 23rd of June, but also longer-term economic decline as a result. I mean, I'm absolutely certain of that. Secondly, the politics of Europe become more difficult when Britain is aside. Britain has always been the firefighter of European troubles, and now it's put a match to some European troubles through this Brexit vote, and I think it's weakened itself. Britain's weakened itself as well as weakening the European Union. It means that Europe is going to be a much less effective partner. It's going to be more complicated for the US to be a partner with Europe with Britain outside it. So that's not good. So I am, and there's the third angle, of course, which is that the integrity of the United Kingdom is in part based on our membership of the European Union because Scotland, Northern Ireland both voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union. And I don't want to be back on this programme in X years' time talking about what used to be Britain.
Don't you want to go home, though, with everything that's going on? I mean, I understand you have a commitment to IRC and to this challenge, but it's got to tug on you.
Oh, of course it does. I mean, but sometimes, you make your own history, but not as you choose. And sometimes you've got to live with the pain.
When we look at the refugee situation worldwide, why should Americans care when much of it is so far away from where they live, and they are contending with their own problems?
Well, that's a great question. Americans should care about the troubles of people far away for two reasons. One, Americans are known for having a big heart. And that's what you'd expect me to say as someone who's leading a charity, and it would be wrong to neglect it. But this is a country that likes to call itself the most generous country in the world. And that's the reason I'll spend less time talking about, but this is a big-hearted country that doesn't want to see people trampled into the dust, especially the most vulnerable. However, my argument is Americans should care about people far away whose names they'll never know and whose countries they may not have heard of, not just because they've got big hearts, but because they've got smart heads. America depends on a stable and prosperous global environment. America is a country that stands by its allies. America is a country that depends on stability around the world. And if America does not invest, yes, in diplomacy, yes, in defense, but also in humanitarian aid, there will be a less stable, more insecure, less prosperous world. And Americans are meant to be strategic and smart. And so there are reasons of the brain as well as the heart that tell you that when America neglects the outside world, it comes back to bite the outside world. You know that in terrible terms. Afghanistan was neglected in the 80s and in the 90s after the Russians, the Soviets were drummed out. And it came back to haunt this country. It came back to haunt the world. And in a connected world, if you neglect part of the world, it'll come back to bite you. And Idaho may feel a long way away from Afghanistan or Congo or Syria, and in truth, it is. But America as a whole is dependent not just to be the world's policeman, which suggests that you're in this rather controlling situation, but your prosperity and your security are in part dependent on what happens far away. And it's a fundamental argument that if you want to earn and gain and enjoy the blessings of a world that has this extraordinary range of opportunity and possibility, then you need to bear the burdens of it. And because you're a richer country, you need to do that with others. And so I would appeal to Americans for reasons of hard-headedness, not just big-heartedness, to understand that cutting yourself off won't actually make you more secure or more prosperous.
Well, thank you. I know
Thank
you're
you.
extremely busy, so I appreciate you taking the time
Delighted
to
to
talk
talk
with
to
me
you.
about that, about the issues that concern you, and good luck.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've been listening to David Miliband, the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Our conversation was recorded at the 2016 Sun Valley Writers Conference. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.